Hey guys, I'm here with Dave Feldman. This guy is awesome. He basically is an outsider that can take complex subjects about cholesterol and break them down for the average person to understand. And what I like about you, you're a software engineer, so you actually think in logic. So you basically looked at this problem from an engineering standpoint, and you actually just really figured it out because, as you would agree, that you would think there's a lot of science in medicine, but doesn't seem to be a lot of common sense when it comes down to cholesterol. There's so much exciting.
Cholesterol in particular,
Yeah,
there really is a sort of prevailing, I want to find a better word for this, but a prevailing attitude towards
yeah,
cholesterol, where it's sort of
agree.
almost a near avoidance of finding good news that associates, especially LDL cholesterol, with positive outcomes.
Yeah. Guys, if you don't know this, Dave is going to be at our summit, okay? And there's a couple little things that we're going to tell you right now that we can't tell you fully, but there's potentially going to be a release of some new information that's quite huge. Right, Dave?
Yes, yes.
Hopefully it'll be done by then.
Hopefully, I mean, one of the things that I think a lot of people can appreciate is it's kind of amazing. I always think that I've reached an apex of the data that I've gathered, both through my own N of 1 experiments and those who follow me. And often I'm wrong. Often, in fact, I don't know of a single time I've been able to give a presentation where at least 50% of it didn't have to change from the last one.
Wow.
It's very common for me to have a whole lot of new data. And in particular, one of the things that has been a very impressive treasure trove is this most recent experiment where I literally gained weight, and in the current phase of the weight loss period of that same experiment, I haven't actually fully lost all of the weight that I gained. And from that, because this has never actually been done before, Eric, and I'm pretty excited to be able to have done this, is that we've never had people who've gone on a low carb ketogenic diet and throughout the whole process took very wide spectrum of tests. And so I thought, I'm going to go ahead and just take this shot all the time, insisting that nobody else follow my shoes. A lot of people get inspired by my experiments, but I say, this is the one not to do, because in order to do it, you have to induce a state of hyperinsulinemia. I was adding, of course, a lot of carbs and fat, and maintaining it at such a level that I was trying to shoot for gaining about 20 to 25 pounds of fat,
Wow.
body fat.
That's
Yeah.
incredible.
And for what it's worth, you really can do it pretty quickly if you get that magic mix going on, particularly with the high carbs. I had my carbs up very, very high.
Wow.
And I got to 19 pounds up. I didn't actually get to the 20 to 25, but I'm okay with that, knowing what I know now. I definitely gathered quite a lot. The primary purpose I was going for actually came back to cholesterol. What I was trying to do is I was trying to see, as many people see themselves when they go on this diet, that at much higher levels of body fat, you may actually have lower relative LDL cholesterol, the so-called bad cholesterol, than you do as you actually lose a lot of weight. So I wanted to both know, okay, does your LDL cholesterol go up as you're losing weight? And also, does your LDL tend to be lower relative to what your LDL cholesterol would be at when you are at a lower rate, if you say stalled? So I actually had hoped to have stalled right at the top, right at the peak there, so that I can make that comparison. As it happens, I didn't. Almost as fast as when I switched over to a ketogenic diet again, the weight started coming off right away. But I got to answer that one question, which is, does LDL-C indeed go up as you lose weight? And I can share that with you now. Yes, it does.
Okay.
Nobody has as pristine a data set as I do. I literally hit my 100th blood draw, I want to say a week and a half ago. And in doing so, I have practically a mapped metabolism. Like I joke about this, but I'm going to probably do it at some point. I literally could get from you, I could have you write down a number between 100 and 350, and I could move my LDL cholesterol to within 20 milligrams per deciliter of that number in like a week. Like I've got it mapped out to that degree without any
Wow.
supplements or medication at all.
Wow.
Yeah, and bottom line is, without question, they can't keep this data down for too long. There's no single larger influencer on your cholesterol levels, no single larger one than your metabolism, particularly your energy metabolism. And if you're powered more by fat, then you are powered more by triglycerides carried in VLDL boats, if you will. And those boats eventually get remodeled to LDL particles. Now, there's some individual variability between those, but that's how I'm able to accomplish that. Well, the value of that is that I've gotten later into these phases of experiments to where I could do this one, which is I could say, okay, well, now that I know what my LDL cholesterol would be at roughly when I'm at a lower weight, if I were to gain weight, I could see what would happen to it on the way up, and I could see what would happen to it on the way down. But why stop at cholesterol? Why not also take a whole bunch of other tests people would not normally take, especially at the switch off? What would be, for example, my inflammatory markers like IL-6, like ferritin, my C-reactive protein, of course. Like what happens to all of these as it changes? On top of that, I got a lot of physical metrics. Like, for example, I got respiratory quotient. We actually have the face mask on and you're actually checking how much you're burning sugar versus burning fat. So I've got that mapped out. But the most explosive data that I can also share with you now has been my, it's something called a carotid intima media thickness test. When
What?
yes,
Wow.
you actually, what you do is, and you may already be familiar with this, it's an ultrasound that you get on the common carotid arteries on the left and right side of the neck. And I've been getting it about every 6 months, starting in, I want to say, mid-2016. So about a year after I'd started keto. And at that time, I was at a very high risk level, which definitely surprised me. But with each of the 6 months, both my left and right side regressed more and more, regressed. So it's supposed to actually slowly increase with your age. But while I was ketogenic, I was slowly actually thinning it on both sides. The right side was thicker and had dropped about 150 nanometers. And the left side was thinner, but actually had dropped another 50 itself. And they came to within 1 nanometer of each other's size by November of last year.
Wow.
Okay, so here's where we dropped the bomb. What then happened after I did this standard American diet experiment, right? Would it have started moving in the other direction? I certainly was speculating a lot on that publicly, and I was saying, well, I wouldn't be surprised if it did. Hopefully it doesn't do it by a lot. And Eric, I'm here to tell you that it did go by a whole lot. It actually went to the highest on both sides.
Wow.
Yeah.
Oh my
In
God.
fact, the right side, which had 150 drop, actually moved up, I want to say 160 or 170. So it was technically the highest on that side. And the left side, which had something like a 40 or 50 nanometer drop, had moved to the highest on its side, crossed 600 for the first time. So when I had been insisting nobody else follow my suit on this
Yeah, right.
experiment,
You're basically,
I not only feel strongly about it now, but on top of that, I tell everybody I know, hey, you know how you've always had like a relative or you yourself who said, hey, I'm going to take a break from the diet for the holidays.
right.
I say, go check out my data here, because I'm going to tell
Wow.
you, I am not anxious to repeat
Wow.
this experiment. Why I'm glad I did all this wide spectrum testing in the first place. And yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say, guys, if you didn't get what he just said, he basically did an experiment to induce a stroke or a heart attack, and it didn't quite happen. But he wanted to test the limit to see how far he could push himself, and basically created a thickening of the walls on the carotid arteries.
Uh,
Unbelievable.
I will 100% concede that had I known that the thickness of the carotid arteries was going to climb that much, I might not have done this experiment at all. It's very possible.
What percentage? You said you're talking about nanometers, but what percentage increase is that?
Gosh, that's I've never had it posed to me that way. I guess you could say, on one side it was about This is really rough math, but I'm going to say like maybe about 20%. And on the other side, I want to say about 25%. I think the thing that'll matter the most is per my age and gender. I had moved from the beginning of this up to November of last year. I had moved from a high risk category to roughly a 20 to 30% group or even lower. In some, I was even below 20%. And then in just the 6 months, and most likely from those last 4 weeks, just before the test was taken, I'd moved from that 20% low risk category up to 85% risk category on the thickness. Now, without question, I'm obviously banking on reducing that thickness again by going fully ketogenic. But here's the kicker, Eric, this cannot be understated. This is the most important thing to take away from this experiment. For all of that time coming up to November of last year, my LDL cholesterol was 200 milligrams per deciliter or higher. That was the average. My LDL particle count was roughly 2,000 nanomoles or higher, right? This is well into the 90th percentile levels of lipoproteins. So if indeed the literature were correct, that alone is a risk factor, because CIMT, this carotid intima media thickness, that is commonly considered to be at risk when you have higher levels of LDL. This flatly disproves this on an N of 1.
So on a for a layperson, explain that in layperson's terminology, as far as the validity of going by LDL versus other tests. Like, how would you explain it to someone who doesn't know about all this stuff?
Just that I would say that in the literature, they try to find proxies for atherosclerosis, which is the buildup of plaque in the arteries. And that's the reason they like the common carotid artery. This is a fairly large artery. It supplies a lot of blood, especially to the brain. And it oftentimes can show an increasing or decreasing of thickening, suggestive of atherosclerotic risk. So with that in mind, usually getting a regular test is something I certainly recommend, because it gives you a sense of, again, it's not a perfect proxy by any means, but it is a fairly commonly used one in the studies. And it's one that they'll often point to suggest that level of risk. Well, obviously it tends to track with the things we're used to being associated with disease, insulin, of course, hyperinsulinemia, inflammation, chronic inflammation. And to be sure, throughout this experiment, I knew I was creating a state of hyperinsulinemia. But I wasn't, as far as I could tell, chronically inflamed or sick in some way, some kind of special illness that might have further influenced it. It was really, seemingly, from my perspective, just those 4 weeks of being on a standard American diet and gaining weight relatively quickly. That clearly is a cause for concern. Now, what'll be curious is whether or not it snaps back, as in maybe I see a very large decrease within 6 months at my next 6-month checkup, or whether it will decline at the same rate as it was for the 2 years that I was getting it every 6 months. And if that's the case, that should only double down just how much you want to be careful about going off diet and gaining a lot of weight, especially cheating.
Right. So then explain the significance of the LDL. You mentioned that, but I want you in simple terms.
Okay. So yes, LDL cholesterol, again, is commonly referred to as the bad cholesterol. And you'll hear quite often, as I certainly do in reading the literature, that as that LDL is high, and they tend to like you to be at under 100 milligrams per deciliter. An LDL of 99 or less is what they target. Some will say if you're high risk, you should be under 70. Some will say even if you're not at high risk, that it's just better to be under 70. But I'm at double that through most of my ketogenic diet on average, except for certain experiments where I'm intentionally manipulating it. And given that I'm at 200 or higher, I would certainly expect that my CIMT would be thickening at a higher rate if the literature is correct. This also applies to, I know I kind of touched on LDL particles. Those are the boats that carry the LDL cholesterol with them. And that too tends to get looked at in literature, especially in the more advanced literature, where they say, you know, I'm sure you've talked about the small dense versus the big fluffy particles, LDL particles. Well, just a lot of lipidologists today would say it's just the total number, and you want that number below 1,000. So if you want that below 1,000 in order to reduce your atherosclerotic risk, certainly if you're like me and running at 2,000 or higher, again, well into the 90th percentile, if you were to grab, you know, 1 million random people in the United States, you're going to find that you have to be above the 90th percentile to have that level of particle count. And to be sure, I can't say for sure until I could see, you know, post versus pre-medicated and so forth. But all that said, without question, I feel that if I went to a lipidology conference today, I said, hey, what do you suppose the odds are that somebody could be running at an LDL cholesterol of above 200, an LDL particle count of above 2,000, and that their carotid intima media thickness would actually be thinning? And I'm kind of tempted to go to a lipidology conference and place bets to raise money on my research. So
Right. That's incredible. Last time I talked to you, you talked about cholesterol and it carrying triglycerides and fat-soluble vitamins and I think vitamin E. Touch on that in very simple terms so people can just understand that the LDL is not the bad guy. It's there to do a purpose. It has a job. It has this function. Your body makes it.
My goodness, I hope you have a few hours to spare, because
Condense it into
it's
2 minutes.
Yeah, I'll attempt to, but
At the summit, I know you're going to cover everything at the summit in detail and make it really clear. So this is just a little teaser, guys, just FYI.
Absolutely. So without question, per what you talked about, there's fat-soluble vitamins A, D, E, and K that are carried by LDL particles. And these are vitamins your cells need. And the degree of accessibility to your tissues matters. So you find that a lot of people have very low levels of LDL particles, the boats that carry these vitamins. They end up having deficiencies, lots of nutrient deficiencies associated with this, because your tissues do in fact need them. But there's another part to this story that I find fascinating. It gets rarely talked about. LDL particles are a key part of your immune defense. They've actually found that people who had a genetic disease, and many currently do today, called familial hypercholesterolemia, often abbreviated to FH. FH often ends up being an advantage towards things like infection. The more LDL particles you have, the more they can help to fight the disease. And that makes sense because they have antioxidants on board. Vitamin E is in fact an antioxidant. And antioxidants, their job is to neutralize free radicals, which are reactive oxygen species. So the more of those you have in play sitting on the shell of these LDL particles, the phospholipid shell, the more capability you have to neutralize these reactive oxygen species. And so it ends up becoming a net advantage towards a lot of this illness, particularly in that fashion. So that's just two. I'm just going to fit in with a third one. A third one is that you'll find a lot of people have an easier time recovering when they're on a low-carb, high-fat diet. And there's hopefully going to be more that I can talk about with this a little bit later. But particularly from my own research, I find that there's a drop in LDL cholesterol and LDL particle count following extensive and rigorous exercise on my part. And I believe that's because, as it turns out, virtually every cell in your body has something known as receptor-mediated endocytosis. I know it's a technical word, but basically it just means it can engulf LDL particles, which makes sense because LDL particles happen to have lots of phospholipids and cholesterol, which guess what? Every membrane of every cell in your body has as well. So they can use those raw materials for repair and growth. And that's very important.
Yeah, and making hormones, testosterone. Yep. And so there's a couple things that I want to just kind of end off with. So let me just kind of, let's see. You basically, there's a good chance you'll be done with some research that you'll be able to reveal at the summit. Okay, there's like 80% chance, guys. So we're crossing our fingers on that one. And also, you mentioned some new data about weight gain loss experience, which
which I
was
kind of covered just now. Yeah, you're talking.
okay.
I'll have some new data on that, but I don't want to mention it until I have the analysis done.
That's totally fine. This is top secret information, guys. You got to come to the summit to hopefully get it, have it be revealed. um, this is awesome. So, guys, we're doing a summit October 13th and 14th in Maryland. It's going to be at the Gaylord Hotel. And you'll come in Friday night and stay for the weekend. We have about 7 or 8 speakers, if you include myself, which you will. And we're excited. So Dave's going to really cover this topic on cholesterol, which is, he's like a human guinea pig. He does massive amounts of tests on himself, and he tracks everything. He's meticulous, very organized. So he's going to be able to summarize this data, which we really appreciate you going through this, so we don't have to do it ourselves. You could just tell us, what are the results? Yeah.
Yes. I'm very excited for the conference. I think it's going to be a lot of fun.
Oh yeah. We're planning, it's going to be mind blowing. People are going to it's going to be one of the biggest events around. So definitely stay tuned for more information, guys. Definitely show up. I'll put a link down below if you haven't seen the website yet. Thanks, Dave, for coming on, and we'll be seeing you at the event.
Thank you for having me.